Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today's topic is a little bit different than the rest of the Roaring Twenties, and it's one of my actual favorite topics. It's a question of what's going on in the cities, and in particular in the inner cities. It's a day known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a term given to a flowering of black culture that started in the 1920s. It's not just a 1920s piece, and that's why it's a little different. This topic could extend into several different units. But it's an explosion of art and culture and poetry and music and theater and just a sense that there's something cool about being African American and the literature that comes with it. You'll study pieces of the Harlem Renaissance in music classes, in English classes. You'll see it in theater and drama productions. It's a real gem of American society. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have two objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to, number 14, identify the causes and results of African American migration to northern cities in the early 1800s. And you should be able to describe the prolific African American artistry that was known as the Harlem Renaissance. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. I think it's 14. My numbering has gone askew. We'll begin in the first Roman numeral on your notes. And here I want to talk about what's known as the Great Migration. From 1910 to 1920, so the years of the Great War, before and afterwards, there was a movement of black people out of the South to other cities, and it was driven as an economic motive. So to go find better work, and it brought thousands of African Americans from the South into northern cities looking for new work, new jobs. The North didn't have the same kind of slave-owning history as the South did, but the North was not free from racism. It was a different kind of racism. But racial tensions now suddenly, with this influx of African Americans that there weren't significant amounts of before kind of this 19-teens time. It escalated racial tensions in the North with about 25 urban race riots in the year 1919. 1919 was a portentous year that had all of the labor troubles that came with it, and race riots were part of that deal. Nevertheless, African Americans continued to migrate in large numbers into the 1920s, into this unit, and by 1920, over 40% of African Americans were living in urban areas. Subpoint B. The changing composition of how black people were interacting with America led to some changes also in the way that how black people thought of themselves as a cohesive unit. Take, for instance, the National Association for the Emancipation of Colored People, the NAACP. It was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, as kind of the successor of the Niagara Institute. We've talked about this before. But they protested racial violence, and W.E.B. Du Bois led a parade of 10,000 black men through New York to go protest violence and to go highlight the struggle for civil rights. NAACP leader James Weldon Johnson, he fought for civil rights legislation, making anti-lynching laws a top priority. These laws were introduced to Congress in 1919, but none of them passed. Still, the NAACP anti-lynching campaign led to a drop in the number of lynchings. Marcus Garvey, next person I want you to meet, this guy's fascinating. He was a publisher, a speaker, and a political activist, and he led a black nationalist party that became known as Garveyism. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, to emphasize Pan-African unity between Africans in Africa and Africans on other continents. Garvey hoped to push European colonizers out of Africa altogether and unify the continent more or less under his leadership. And the continent is big. That's a big goal. But to enact laws to go ensure black racial purity. He never actually visited the continent. He never actually made it to Africa. But his Back to Africa movement urged African Americans to go leave the United States and go create new unity on that continent. He was an electric and a controversial figure. He collaborated with the Ku Klux Klan. They had an interest in shared racial separation, which clashed with other prominent civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who wanted to see an integrated society. Marcus Garvey's influence waned over time. He got caught up in a business scandal for a black-owned passenger ship. He was vilified as a con artist. He served on trial. He was called to trial in 1923 and was convicted of mail fraud. And that was sort of the end of Marcus Garvey's cultural relevancy. But man, he was an electric guy when he was at his peak. Roman numeral number 11, maybe 15, maybe. Here I want to focus on specifically the Harlem Renaissance. It was an artistic movement, an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City during the 1920s. So Harlem, so New York City, kind of the northern part of Manhattan, is a city known as, or a neighborhood known as Harlem, and it's kind of a traditional black community. It was the world's largest black urban area, made up of black people from the United States, but also a lot of Caribbean immigrants, black people out of the Caribbean coming up to America, living in Harlem also. The movement included new African-American cultural expressions across the urban areas in the Northeast and the Midwest. So really what we call it the Harlem Renaissance, it wasn't just in this one neighborhood. It was really a flowering of black culture across the country. It's considered to have been a rebirth of the African-American fine and performing arts, as well as literature and culture. Subpoint B, I want to focus on some of those black writers and some of my favorite people to read. And the first person I want to introduce you to is Claude McKay. Claude McKay was a Jamaican immigrant whose poems urged black people to resist the prejudice and discrimination of the day. He expressed the pain of life in black ghettos in a world dominated by white people. Just really stirring poetry. The next person I want you to meet is Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes lived in Kansas City for a while. He grew up in Joplin, Missouri. And I love his poetry. They have a certain like jazz tempo to them. When you read them, they almost have like the rhythms of jazz music that come out in the way they're phrased. It's really lyrical, beautiful writing. But he's describing really hard things. It's beautiful writing over tough things like the difficult lives of the working class. But they do have just excellent, the tempo, you read them out loud and so you just fall into that rhythm. It's amazing work. And the third person I want you to meet is Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston showed how the folkways and values of Southern poor black people and really in her writing. So she's not focusing necessarily on urban areas, although there is some, the folkways implies maybe a little bit more rural points of view. And she actually considered that the lives that poor, unschooled African Americans were living and the way that they would live their lives in the hard struggle, that was a type of poetry. And she said it's actually the greatest wealth of the continent, celebrating what she called the common person's art form of ingenuity and strength, the things that you only get by surviving the hard times. And that's a different kind of art than what people found. But Zora Neale Hurston said, that's real art, and she wrote about it in her works. Subpoint C. The popularity of the Harlem Renaissance went beyond black audiences. It turns out this was real crossover stuff that white people could appreciate also. Shows and actors became crossover hits and even stars, appealing to black audiences and white audiences alike. Take, for instance, the musical comedy Shuffle Along. Shuffle Along, I think we could say, launched the Harlem Renaissance movement. It was popular with white audiences, but it featured the talents of black performers, putting black people up on the stage. And one of those people that, on the stage was a huge crossover. It was a guy named Paul Robeson. He was a son of a one-time slave. He was a major dramatic actor and singer. Robeson was a prolific recording artist and recorded and released 276 pieces of music across 5 decades. He spanned genres from Americana and popular standards and classical music. He's doing European folk songs and political songs and poetry and spoken words from plays. He did it all. He was an accomplished actor. He toured America and Great Britain. He performed works as widely varying as Shakespeare's Othello to the Broadway musical Showboat. He later attracted political controversy because he supported the support of colonized people, an eventual turn to advocating communism. His performing career waned by the 1950s as he became politically unpopular along the way. Subpoint D. But my favorite thing to talk about, this is one of those things that I wish that YouTube didn't put so many restrictions on. It's kind of a tough way to show this, and maybe we'll try to find other ways. But if we could listen to this music, and we're going to respect YouTube's copyright laws and not put them in this video. But man, if we could, African Americans bring about the era of jazz here in the Roaring 20s. Jazz was born in the early 20th century in the city of New Orleans. It came about kind of the cultural mix of New Orleans. It's kind of a strange city in its history, but it was the right recipe to bring together a uniquely American art form known as jazz. And it spread across the United States to Chicago, to Kansas City as one of the homes of jazz, to later to New York. The sound blended ragtime music and blues blues music and emphasized new rhythms. In 1918, a guy named Joe Oliver, they knew him as King Oliver, and he moved from New Orleans to Chicago and brought that jazz sound to a different part of the country and introduced the sound to northern listeners. Joe King Oliver, the way that he brought the sound out of New Orleans to go bring to the rest of the world, it's great. He becomes the ambassador of jazz. The next person I want you to meet is Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong had a very long career. In his early days, we knew him as a trumpeter. He did a variety of things, not just trumpet work, particularly later in his year once he lost, in his old age, he'd lost his chops and just became a vocalist. But he was once a member of King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. But he made the personal expression really the heart of jazz, being able to give emotion into the work. And Louis Armstrong was the best at it. He improvised large portions of his performances, just like didn't have the sheet music, just got up there and improvised some pieces, kind of what he was feeling like at the time. And that really becomes the hallmark of the lasting jazz sound, the improvisation, what the artist is feeling in the moment. Like parts are usually scripted, but then parts are just like big blanks that a soloist or a couple of people jamming together can just go pieces of. That's really the heartbeat of jazz, and it starts with Louis Armstrong. He later moved to New York with the Fletcher Henderson Band, the most important jazz big band of the city. Louis Armstrong remains today the most influential musician in jazz history, whether as a vocalist or an instrument performer, a musician there. The next person I want you to meet is Duke Ellington. Edward Kennedy Ellington, but everybody called him Duke. He was a jazz pianist and orchestra leader, America's greatest composers. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, he was the man that was like one of the best composers and arrangers of his day. With songs like Mood Indigo of the 1930s and Sophisticated Lady of 1932. It's one of my favorite jazz pieces. Duke Ellington easily crossed over between Negro music and the white audiences. Everybody loved Duke Ellington. People still like Duke Ellington. His sound really holds up. Bessie Smith was a blues singer, so she's not specifically a jazz singer. There is a distinction, and a stronger distinction in this era than in our own. But she was a blues singer and considered by many to be maybe the best vocalist of the decade. Man or woman, black or white, Bessie Smith was it. In 1927, she actually became the highest paid black artist in the entire world with enormous popularity and major record company support. These artists were really the backbones of the subculture of America, but also knocked on the door of a greater popular culture. It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.